In Chapter 11, we begin our discussion of the endocrine system. We have a picture here on the very first slide of Robert Wadlow. Robert Wadlow, of course, was 8'11" as a result of gigantism, an overproduction of growth hormone by the anterior pituitary, and we'll talk more about that disorder and growth hormone in the appropriate part of the chapter. We begin here in 11.1 with a simple description of the difference between endocrine and exocrine glands. Just a reminder, as we look at this diagram from our text, that an exocrine gland has a duct, D-U-C-T, a duct. And so an exocrine gland is secreting substance onto a surface of the body. Sweat glands would be a good example of an exocrine gland. The hydrochloric acid glands of the stomach would be another good example of an exocrine gland. Endocrine glands differ from those in that they secrete a product, molecule of one type or another, into the extracellular fluid, which then makes its way into the blood and is transported throughout the body, being exposed to all the different cells of the body. As a side note here, we do point out that we distinguish hormones from paracrine substances simply based on the distance that they travel. So paracrine substances travel very short distances and impact cells in the specific area, whereas hormones, by definition, travel throughout the body. The endocrine system is going to be a little bit different than some of the other systems that we have discussed. One difference is this, that what we notice is that there are many different organs in the body that produce hormones. And so it's not like the nervous system, in which we have a brain, spinal cord, and all the neurons that branch off, nerves and therefore neurons, that branch off of that structure. So here we have a number of separate organs, not connected directly to one another throughout the body, that all produce hormones of one type or another. In some cases, a single gland may produce multiple hormones, the pancreas, of course, being a good example of that. And we do see that some organs are just part-time endocrine organs, as we'll talk about shortly. They have some other function, but they also produce a hormone. As we look at types of hormones, what we notice is that we have three types of hormones: amine hormones, peptide hormones, and steroid hormones. We'll begin section 11.2 with a brief discussion of amine hormones. Amine hormones are all derivatives of the amino acid tyrosine, and they include thyroid hormone, dopamine, and the catecholamines. So thyroid hormone is discussed in more detail later in this particular chapter, but we'll simply mention at this point that it exists in two forms, and they're both illustrated on this particular slide. So here we see thyroxine, tetraiodothyronine, in other words, is the full name, otherwise known as T4. And then we have triiodothyronine, T3. Both of these are produced by cells in the body, and both of these impact with the thyroid hormone receptors, but they have different affinities. These two hormones have different affinities for the thyroid hormone receptors, as we'll talk about a bit later in our chapter. Next, we have the catecholamines. The catecholamines are familiar to you because of our discussions in the nervous system. And so, in the case of the endocrine system, these are produced by the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla produces 80% epinephrine and 20% norepinephrine. This is because it possesses the enzyme that converts norepinephrine to epinephrine, and therefore most of what's produced is epinephrine. The sympathetic nerves that you have discussed previously in the nervous system chapter lack this particular enzyme, and so they only secrete norepinephrine. Interestingly, though, the epinephrine and norepinephrine interact with the same receptors, and so have a similar impact on the body, contributing to that overall fight or flight response, and the fact that the sympathetic nervous system is not activated in a piecemeal fashion, but is rather activated all at once or not at all. Lastly, we have dopamine. Dopamine is secreted by the hypothalamus, and it is, interestingly, travels via a portal system to the anterior pituitary, and we'll talk about the details of that. But interestingly, dopamine is a prolactin inhibitor, and we'll see that all the hormones of the anterior pituitary rely on cues from the hypothalamus to be released. And so in this case, dopamine serves as the controlling hormone in the anterior pituitary for prolactin release. We make our way next to peptide and protein hormones. And what we notice is this: these are the most common type of hormone. So most hormones are polypeptides, and they vary in length dramatically. From thyroid releasing hormone, which we'll talk about in the context of the thyroid system a little bit later, which is only 3 amino acids in length, to insulin and its precursor, pre-proinsulin, which are quite long, pre-proinsulin being 110 amino acids in length. Growth hormone is even bigger at 191 amino acids in length. Still, it's worth noting that these hormones are relatively short as far as proteins go. Of course, a 1,000 amino acid protein wouldn't be surprising at all in other contexts, but in the case of the endocrine system, most of the hormones that are composed of amino acids are on the short side, and we typically refer to them, therefore, as peptide hormones as opposed to protein hormones. Now, one thing we notice is this, that oftentimes during the synthesis of these peptide hormones, they're synthesized in an inactive form and then activated following synthesis. So a good example would be insulin. And so insulin, like many hormones, is synthesized as a pre-pro hormone. If we look down at this diagram, we see pre-proinsulin shown there. And so it has the components of insulin, as we'll see in a moment, but it also has some other portions to that amino acid chain. It then is the signal sequence, in this case, the end sequence of amino acids there is cleaved, and that takes us from pre-proinsulin to proinsulin. And so a prohormone is one step closer to the actual functional hormone. And then lastly, what we see is that we convert pre-proinsulin into insulin. And by doing so, we remove quite a large stretch of amino acids. And interestingly, and this is not uncommon in the endocrine world, this peptide, this long green peptide that's removed, also has an endocrine function, as does, of course, obviously insulin. So both insulin and the green amino acid chain, which is C-peptide, are released into the blood, circulate through the body, and have a particular function. So these peptide hormones are also often synthesized in inactive form and then converted from pre-pro hormones to prohormones, then to the active form of the hormone by removing segments of amino acid from the hormone. The last type of hormone that we want to cover are steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are primarily produced by the adrenal cortex and the gonads, but they're also produced by the placenta during pregnancy. Estrogen and progesterone are produced there. We also don't want to forget about the last steroid hormone that we want to mention, vitamin D, or calcitrol, which is originally produced in the skin upon exposure to UV radiation, and then it undergoes modification in both the liver and the kidneys before making its way to the GI tract to have an impact on calcium absorption. All steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol, and the enzymes present determine which hormone will be produced. Interestingly, estrogen and testosterone go through a similar biosynthetic pathway, but depending on the enzymes present, you end up with more of one or the other. It's of course impossible to hold steroid hormones in vesicles, as is the case for protein hormones, for instance, because they're lipid soluble, immediately cross through those plasma membranes and make their way into circulation. So they do diffuse immediately into circulation upon synthesis. They're not very soluble in the blood, but typically rely on carriers. Albumin would be a good example. In other words, a protein carrier transports them from one place to another in the body. The lower right-hand side of the screen, we have nice depictions of the major steroid hormones found in the body, all consisting, of course, as we know, of 4 fused carbon rings, and then the functional groups vary depending on which particular hormone we are referring to. It's easy to remember that the gonads produce steroid hormones, but it's sometimes tempting to forget that a number of different steroid hormones are produced by the adrenal cortex as well. So, reminding ourselves briefly that here in the lower right-hand corner of our diagram, we have the adrenal gland. The kidney, of course, would sit where the cursor is moving now, just below the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland sits on top of the kidney. And the adrenal gland is an odd gland because it consists of 2 really unrelated portions, only related by the location. So in the core, we have the adrenal medulla, which of course secretes epinephrine primarily and norepinephrine, But then the adrenal cortex surrounds that adrenal medulla, and we have these three layers that we want to mention now. So we notice that we have three types of steroid hormones produced by the adrenal cortex. We have aldosterone, which is known as a mineralocorticoid. And so aldosterone, as we'll talk in more detail about later, is involved in the kidney's handling of sodium, potassium, and hydrogen ions. In other words, how many of these are going to be excreted, how many of these are going to be retained. We also have cortisol and corticosterone, which are produced by the adrenal cortex. And so this is probably a steroid hormone that we're more familiar with. These are glucocorticoids, and so they have a profound influence on the body's handling of glucose. And they also have an impact on the immune system, as we are aware. These are hormones that are released in response typically to chronic stress. Cortisol is the dominant hormone that's released here. And we'll talk a good bit more about cortisol during the course of our chapter. Lastly, perhaps surprisingly, we have androgens that are released here. So male sex hormones. Not testosterone. These are less potent than testosterone. But nonetheless, they do have an impact in some cases. So they have an impact on the developing fetus, and they have an impact on female vertebrate physiology and behavior. They are really diluted by testosterone in the male, so they have a less profound impact in the male. But in the instances we just mentioned there, there is either no testosterone or very low levels, and so they do have a very profound impact. So if we look at the adrenal cortex, we see that the outermost layer is the zona glomerulosa, which produces aldosterone. We have the zona fasciculata, which produces cortisol and small amounts of androgens, and then the zona reticularis is the innermost layer, which produces androgens and then a small amount of cortisol. And of course, different enzymes are present in each of these three layers, allowing production of all of these hormones. What we notice in the case of the gonads is this, that both major sex hormones, testosterone and 17-beta estradiol, are produced by both sexes, but the concentrations vary dramatically. And the concentrations vary as a result of the enzyme aromatase, as we see in this picture from our text. So it all starts with cholesterol, as we realize. We go to a precursor, and that precursor either goes via aromatase to estrone and then 17-beta estradiol, or it goes to testosterone. Testosterone can also be converted via aromatase to estradiol. So in the case of ovary cells, we have high concentrations of aromatase, and therefore we have the dominant steroid hormone that we end up with is estrogen, the form of estrogen in vertebrates. The primary form is 17-beta estradiol. Or in the case of testicular cells, we lack aromatase, and so we end up primarily with testosterone. So it is worth noting that in females, we do produce low amounts of 17-beta estradiol, and in males, we do produce low amounts of estrogen, but it's the concentrations. Both hormones are present in both sexes, but it's the concentrations that make the difference in phenotype. It's also worth noting that progesterone is a hormone that's produced by females, and so it's a hormone that's very important in the menstrual cycle and in the maintenance of pregnancy once pregnancy occurs.